You should be able to see my screen. Is that all good your end, Deepti? Give me a thumbs up. All good. So welcome everyone to this policy indicator training session for the 1,000 Cities Challenge. It's great to see you all on the call. This is the second of our 2 training sessions this round. And so we had a couple of days ago our first session, and this is the follow-up. And it's been great to see people's engagement and interest in the policy indicator work. So it's my pleasure to be co-facilitating this session today. So I'm Dr. Melanie Lowe, and I am a Senior Research Fellow at RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia, and also currently co-director of the Global Observatory of Healthy and Sustainable Cities, which is co-hosting the 1,000 Cities Challenge, which we'll be talking about today. And I'm going to be co-facilitating with Deepti. Did you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, Melanie. Hello, everyone. I'm Deepti Adlaka. I'm an associate professor of urban health at the Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands, and I'm co-leading the development of policy indicators with Melanie. And I will say it is close to midnight here, so I apologize in advance. Melanie is going to help me stay on track as we get through the webinar today.
Thank you very much for staying up so late. And if other people are in odd time zones, thank you very much to you too. So perhaps because we are a bigger group, if you'd like to introduce yourselves through the chat, maybe just mention in the chat box your name. You could mention your organisation and the city that you're from, if you're comfortable doing so. So before we get into the session, I do want to acknowledge 2 really important groups. So firstly, the Executive Committee for the whole 1,000 Cities Challenge, because of their oversight and leadership of the whole project. And then also the Policy Indicator Working Group, which has been working diligently and thoughtfully at helping us to refine and develop the policy checklist tool, which we'll be going through today. And so what are we going to be covering in this session? So we've got the hour, and we'll be focusing on trying to teach you, and hopefully you come away with the skills to collect policy information for your city and to use the 1,000 Cities Challenge policy indicators to actually assess whether the policies for your city support urban health and sustainability. So I'll begin by providing a very brief introduction to the 1,000 Cities Challenge policy indicators, particularly if you haven't joined our previous webinars or are new to the challenge. I'll hand over to Deepti, who'll get into how do we get started with the policy checklist, and then back to me, where we'll go through some explanation, but also some demonstrations of how to fill in the policy checklist and importantly to find the policy documents to do that. And then we'll go to some questions and answers at the end. This session is designed to be interactive, so we do encourage you to participate in the discussion topics that we've got throughout the session, and you can do so by raising your hand or posting in the chat. But also, if questions arise as we're going through, we do want you to raise your virtual hand. We can unmute and have questions, or we can save them for the times where we're going to be having some more formal discussion. And it might be easier if you do have a question to pop it in the question and answer box rather than the chat, and we can use the chat predominantly for discussion. If you get confused with that, don't worry, we'll be monitoring both of those boxes on the Zoom. So by way of background and introduction, the Global Observatory of Healthy and Sustainable Cities provides comparable and evidence-based spatial and policy indicator data of healthy and sustainable built environments. So currently, the observatory hosts indicator scorecards and reports for 25 cities that are spread across the globe. And the 1,000 Cities Challenge is really about sharing our open source methods and tools so that anyone can use those to calculate indicators for their city. So in this way, we're upscaling the Global Observatory to include as many cities as possible internationally. And it's great to see that we've got people joining the call from a range of different countries and regions. So by participating in the challenge, you'll be able to generate an indicator report and scorecard for your city and have that included in the Global Observatory. And importantly, also, you'll be joining our international collaboration. And I did want to clarify that the 1,000 Cities Challenge includes 2 different types of indicators. So the policy indicators, which will be the focus of our training session today, but also a suite of spatial indicators of urban design and transport features that complement the policy indicators. And so you can choose to either yourself or work with the team to calculate the spatial indicators alongside the policy indicators, or you can just choose to focus on the policy indicators. That's just fine. And I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that there is separate training resources available for the spatial indicators available on the Global Observatory website. So the open access tool for the policy indicators for the 1,000 Cities Challenge is this easy to use policy checklist, which is a screenshot here. And it helps you and perhaps your team to assess both whether there are the right policies in place, so policy presence, as well as the quality of those policies in terms of whether they do support the creation of healthy and sustainable cities. We'll be going through the checklist, obviously, in a lot more detail later. And just a quick overview of the 1,000 Cities Challenge policy indicators. So there are these kind of 13 categories of policy indicators in the checklist. So they are a comprehensive suite of measures, and they are based on evidence. So they are derived from last year's Lancet Global Health series on urban design, transport and health. And so we can see here they cover everything from integrated land use and transport planning and air pollution controls, destination accessibility by public transport, the distribution of employment, the management of demand for car driving, urban design characteristics, housing density, distance to public transport, transport investment by governments according to the different transport modes, disaster mitigation is going to be increasingly important, the desirability of the environment for walkability, diversity of land uses, and also destination proximity. So you can see from this list that we're really talking about policies across a whole range of sectors and domains. So for the policy checklist, you will be looking at a whole range of different policy types and across a whole range of sectors. Okay, so now I'm going to, if I can change the slide, I'm going to pass over to Deepti now, who will just take us through, how do you actually get started with this policy checklist? I'm going to stop sharing and switch over to Deepti.
Thank you, Melanie. All right, so I'm going to start sharing and hopefully you can see that. Yeah, so as Melanie said, I'm going to walk you through a few steps to help you understand what the where the policy checklist is first located, how to download it, and then go through a few steps to help you get started. So as you can see on the screen, we have the URL from where you can download the checklist. It's healthysustainablecities.org/resources. And in a minute, I'm going to pull up the website and show that to you. Within the checklist, we have a few steps. So step 1 is identifying the people to collect the data, which is all of you on the call today. What I would also recommend is that you think about people in your network. We suggest for those of you in academia, if you have students interested, it could be a master's student, a PhD student, or a postdoctoral candidate. For those of you who have great connections with government or local agencies, the private sector, we encourage you to collaborate with people out in and outside of your network to complete the checklist. And step 2 is identifying relevant policy documents and entering details into the checklist, which I'll walk you through in a minute. So when you click on this link, it should open up the browser, and hopefully you can still see my screen. This pulls up our observatory website, and on this we have 2 webinars linked, which give you an introduction to what the 1,000 Cities Challenge is if you need more information. And right here on the bottom right, we have the policy indicator checklist. So you click on that, open it, and save it on on your computer. So for today's webinar, I've already saved one of these checklists, but we'll just get back and discuss step 2, which is levels of government. I'd like to particularly draw attention to this because it is an important aspect of the checklist. We, as the Global Observatory, aim to include the whole metropolitan area of cities. And by that, we mean we want to apply the checklist to the area which affects most of the metropolitan population. So we encourage you to include the entire metropolitan area and think about that as you're filling out the checklist. However, we understand that there may be exceptions. And if you are only assessing a smaller administrative unit within a larger area, we've provided some space in the collections tab to explain why you're doing this. So as an example, I'm going to pull up the checklist now. So hopefully you see that. This is the first tab is the instructions tab, where we have a lot more detail on each of the steps. So I have step 1 there. And as we discussed, you identify who would be best to collaborate with to complete that. And of course, that's all of you as well. Identifying relevant documents and applying it to the whole metropolitan area. And as an example, I filled out this tab just to give you a sample of what it looks like. Now, I completed it for the city of Delft, where I'm currently located. So as you can see right on top, you fill in your details, the city, region, and country. Now, in the case of Delft, what I find relevant here for this local context is at the national scale, it is the government of the Netherlands, which outlines certain policies that are included in our checklist in the indicators. There are certain policies which are stipulated by the regional government, which is the province of Holland. And then for the metropolitan area of Delft, the municipality also has certain policies. So each of those levels of government are equally important as I try to complete this checklist. So in this box here, we have space for other comments, which I've said is not applicable here since I am assessing 3 levels of government. And then right here at the bottom, we recommend you complete this as well. We ask about the environmental disasters that are likely to be faced by your city over the next 5 to 10 years. In the case of Delft, it is flooding, heat waves, and then there might be droughts and poor air quality down the road. So as you can see, I filled it out here. And we asked this because, as Melanie showed you, in our list of indicators, we have a disaster mitigation indicator. So this directly informs that indicator. And then I'll quickly go back to the slides. So we'll take a quick pause here before we get into the actual checklist, and Melanie will walk you through that. But we'd like you to maybe even unmute and tell us what city you're going to be assessing and what levels of government policy you would analyze for your city and why. You're also welcome to put it in the chat and we'll monitor that. So this is a good place to pause and also give you space to ask any questions that you might have.
I was just going to add that, of course, as Deepti has presented, you can assess any level of government and be included in the 1,000 Cities Challenge. But the reason why we encourage that focus on the metropolitan scale is because we are aiming for, as much as possible, for international comparability. So if we have, one city assessing just a smaller sub area and then another city assessing the whole metropolitan region, it is harder to draw those comparisons, and we'll have to treat those slightly differently on the observatory and denote that. So that's why we have that encouragement. It's not a mandate that you have to assess the metropolitan scale, but it is an encouragement to do so for that international comparability, if that makes sense. Does anyone want to just, if you feel more comfortable, just mentioning which city you'll be assessing in the chat? And if anyone has any questions, particularly about what level of government, if you're thinking, oh, I'm actually not sure, do I need to just assess one or do I need to assess more? This is your chance to ask or to mention what you've already decided. No one? come on. We can, don't be shy. Let's pop your hand up and ask if or make a comment here.
Yep.
Okay, so Klaus is saying focusing on cities in Germany, and I should mention that Klaus also did some cities included in our first 25 case study for the Lancet Global Health series. So that's great that there might be some extra German cities included. Brisbane in the Gold Coast. Thank you, Sarah.
And I think Maria started with Porto, the Porto metropolitan area.
Great. Yep. Yep. And Helsinki.
We have a nice geographical spread.
Yeah. So the Spanish team will be assessing a total of 10 cities in Spain. So that's going to be great to get that kind of within country comparison. And that I should mention is definitely something that you could consider, depending on your capacity and resourcing, is you could just start with one city, but there's the potential to include more. If you feel that that's an efficient way of actually doing it, once you've learned how to do it once, you can then reproduce that. Canberra, Australia. Excellent. And the other thing is, I'm not sure if we still have Eugen Resendez on the call, who is our membership manager, but we have processes if you've signed up to the 1,000 Cities Challenge of if you indicate which city you are interested in assessing, we can actually also connect you with others who may well be interested in your city. So if you haven't already got your own team, or if there are in fact two of you that you're not aware of each other that are interested in engaging in this, we can actually be a vehicle to connect you. But later in the presentation, we can remind you how you can sign up for the 1,000 Cities Challenge. But that is one key aspect of why you might sign up to be part of the mailing list, etc., so that we can actually ensure that we connect you with other people in your city.
Yeah, and we have cities. The Caesar are saying 10 cities in Mexico, several cities in Japan. We have folks from Chile, 6 cities in Brazil. That's great.
Wonderful. And a few different people have indicated levels of government there. So, you know, often in cities, there is more than one level of government. So I can see that in Japan, Takumi has mentioned that there might be municipal and regional levels of government that are relevant, and that is, you know, often the case. Deepti and I were in charge of facilitating the data collection for the first 25 cities that are on the observatory, and in most cases, in fact almost all, there was multiple levels of government that we had to look at the metropolitan scale.
Oh, and we have a question.
Yeah, Sarah, did you want to unmute and ask, or we can just read it out?
Yes, sure. Thank you. My question was about like partnering with local governments and starting talking with them about the project. So one of the potential questions will be how the government is going to be using the findings in terms of the IP. I'm asking the question whether they can, for example, share the scores on their website and share it with the community or not. If you can please explain a little bit around it, would be great.
Yeah, so all of the findings, and so as we're discussing, all of the tools and methods on the Global Observatory are open access, and then the information that is gathered and the reports and scorecards that are produced are made publicly available on the observatory. And as long as there was you know, due acknowledgement of yourself and that this work had come from the 1,000 Cities Challenge, the government partner would be welcome to also, you know, promote that score or to share the scorecard and report. That would be fantastic, in fact, for making sure that, you know, we're spreading the word about areas of strengths and limitations and policy frameworks. I think that would be a wonderful outcome, actually. And I don't, yeah, so there's no, this whole project is around, you know, it's all open source, open access, building the data commons. And so there's no issues there, as long as it's just really about due acknowledgement of where the information comes from. Does that answer your question?
Fantastic. Yes, thank you very much.
All right, I reckon we might keep going. I'll go back to, just need to catch up with the slides, I'm sorry. And so now I'm going to go over the checklist at a high level, and then we'll go into a bit more detail about actually how you go about filling it in. So Deepti has explained the first 2 tabs of this Excel spreadsheet that we're calling the policy checklist. So there's the instructions and the collection details. And they're your starting point. And then the 3rd tab in there that I've circled at the bottom is what is shown here on the screen as a screenshot. And this policy checklist table is where you'll spend the majority of your time actually collecting and entering the policy information. So just a brief overview of what this checklist kind of involves. The top left-hand corner, we see that there's indicators first. And so here the example is the category of indicators is healthy and walkable city policies. And for that category of indicators, there is a whole range of indicators. So we can see here on the slide, the density indicator. The next column in is the measures, and the measures are really the more specific ways that the indicator can be broken down and be measured. And then the next column is the principles column, and that asks, is the policy aligned with the principles of healthy and sustainable cities? And under each of these, the measures, there are both, the option of yes, the policy is aligned with the principles of healthy and sustainable cities, or no, it doesn't align with those principles. And then for each principle where there is relevant information, a relevant policy, the columns to the right are where you actually enter that information, as highlighted here on the slide. So the first step in actually filling out the checklist is finding the relevant policy documents. So for the policy data collection, you will need to identify a whole range of urban and transport policies, and they might be everything from strategic policies to urban design or transport guidelines, regulation, or they could be legislative documents. And they may come from different levels of government, depending on your city context and the scale that you're measuring. But they also are likely to come from a range of different sectors, as I've mentioned, because of the diversity of the indicators that we're interested in. But I suppose just to emphasise, there is that overarching lens that we're interested in, the city planning, the spatial planning of cities. So my tip would be to use the indicators, or particularly the measures in the policy checklist table as a guide for searching for relevant policy documents, because they'll actually help you to identify and know what types of documents you're actually looking for. So here, with the example of the design indicator, it automatically gives you a sense that you're probably looking for something, a key document like a metropolitan land use plan or an urban design guideline. But we're also looking for measures around street connectivity and pedestrian infrastructure requirements. So you might also look at transport policies. So once you've, in terms of finding the relevant documents, there's really a combination of approaches that you could use. And all of these are complementary. So in the first instance, you might use your existing knowledge of the current urban policies, the guidelines and legislation for your city. And this is why it's really important if yourself or other people that you're working with who are actually collecting the policy data have that reasonably good knowledge of the current and most relevant policies, because that will make that a lot easier. Secondly, there's obviously a very complementary policy to make sure that you haven't missed anything, is to browse government websites or policy repositories, or in fact do more targeted searching. And particularly when you're searching, you might use the keywords from the policy checklist and relevant synonyms of those terms that you see there in local language as the search terms, so that you know what sort of policy documents you're actually searching for. And depending on your country, there may well be a policy repository that's relevant. So in Australia, we do have one that I've got here on the slide if you're interested. But it is worth checking whether your country or your city has some sort of policy repository, because that can be a really good resource. And lastly, complementing the first two approaches is to use your networks and connections. So particularly seeking advice from government policymakers if you yourself do not currently work within government. The people who work within government are often just the most in touch with the latest developments in policy, knowing that policy has recently been superseded and you know, that there is a new policy. And on that note, I did want to emphasize that for the purposes of the checklist, we are looking at current policies. So they can have been adopted a while ago, but they still need to be relevant or enforced at the time of analysis and have not been superseded, just so that we're collecting the most relevant information for that time point. Okay, another moment where we can pause for some discussion, and here, just interested in knowing what are the best ways of finding policy documents for your city. And again, you might already have ideas, or please do ask us any questions on this. In particular, we have come across examples where in some cities, some policies may not even be publicly available or searchable on websites. And it might be that you actually need to go and, you know, get physical paper copies, or that someone actually needs to send them to you who works in government. So, you know, if that's the situation, obviously you need to take a very different approach to finding the policy documents relative to being able to search websites and that sort of thing. So yeah, feel free, add to the chat. We've got a good chat stream going there, but also raise your hand if you've got any questions. Have we had any questions come through, Deepti, while I've been?
I think there was one. Carl responded to that. That was on the spatial indicator side.
Great. Around open data licenses. Yep. Excellent. Is there any questions about how you might go about finding policy documents for your city?
We have one on language. The checklist is available just in English. Yes, at the moment it is just in English.
Yes, it is available just in English. And I think, you know, if there is interest and demand for translation into other languages, that's certainly something we could look into. But at the moment, it's in English and requires, if you're working in another language in terms of the policy content, that you do your best to translate that content for us into English. We can then also work on providing reports and scorecards back in your local language for the local purposes, so that there's reduces language barriers there. But at the moment, for the actual data collection and analysis, it is in English language. But your feedback on that would be appreciated. Any other questions before we move on? Okay. So now let's go into a bit more about detail about how we actually fill in the policy checklist. So for each measure, the checklist columns to the right-hand side that I showed you, they ask for a whole series of information. So for each principle, it asks, is there a relevant policy, first of all? And then if there is, what is the relevant wording or the content of that policy related to that principle? Is the policy mandatory or legally required? Because this does have significant implications for whether a policy is implemented as fully and as intended. Does the policy include a measurable target to help guide that implementation and accountability? And lastly, is the measurable target an evidence-informed threshold? And here we provide some guidance, but really asking for you to indicate whether the policy aligns with the best practice or the established evidence on what is required for creating healthy and sustainable cities. So to fill in the checklist, you're going to actually have to look at the content of the policy documents and extract the relevant information and the detail. So, you know, how do you actually go about doing that? Well, there's a few ways you could do it. I think one option, of course, is to read the document in full and pull out the relevant content as you come across it. But we are aware that some documents, particularly large metropolitan strategic documents or perhaps legislation like an act, they can actually be very long. They could be 100 plus pages, and it may not be practical for you to actually read every word. So ideally, in those situations, maybe think about ways that you can more easily target the information that you need in the document. And some tips for doing that, and these are just some ideas, you might have other ways, is first of all to look at if there is any sort of table of contents that can help you find the relevant section of a document, so then you could just read the relevant section or sections, or to actually do some, again, targeted searching where you use Control F to find or search functions, particularly if you're working with websites or downloaded PDFs, to actually find the relevant content according to keywords from the policy checklist. And here I would say that the measures are useful, but particularly the keywords from the principles, because we're looking for content related to each principle is most useful. And again, just to emphasize that, make sure that you're looking for synonyms, appropriate synonyms of the words that are in the checklist as relevant to your local context, but also local languages. So it might be useful to, we'll go through an example in a moment, but if we were looking at street connectivity, not just searching for connectivity in English, if we're working in English language, but also other key aspects of that, like intersections or street block, some of the other keywords that might be relevant for that particular measure or principle. So I'm now going to switch to going through a few examples of how we actually might fill in that checklist. So I'm hoping I'm still sharing screen and that now the checklist is in front of you. So this is the policy checklist tab that I mentioned. And the first thing I wanted to draw your attention to is right at the top here, we actually have pre-filled an example from Adelaide in South Australia, to demonstrate some of the ways in which you enter the information. But I'm also just going to go through some examples now. And as we've already discussed in the last discussion, please do try and enter the information into English and translate as best you can if you're working in a language other than English. So the first example I was going to demonstrate is, and I've just highlighted the rows that I'm going to demonstrate just to draw my attention to it so that I know and I don't miss them. So the first one is this very first item. I wanted to go through this one because it is a little different to most of the other rows, because it's asking more of a governance related question. So in the indicator, integrated transport and urban planning, there's the measure around transport and planning being combined in one government department, because that can indicate alignment of those two sectors. So here, imagine if I was filling this out for my home city of Melbourne in Australia. This is a simple yes, no drop-down box. I'm just going to make the screen a little larger for you. So here I would put yes, because for Melbourne, it is combined in one government department at the moment, and it's the state government is the relevant metropolitan level of government. Now, if I scroll across all the way to the right-hand side, there is the option here for me to add other information or notes. And this is an opportunity to add anything relevant, but also if in other items, other columns, you've entered unclear for some reason, it's your opportunity to explain why you've chosen that choice. But here, because the national level of government is also relevant for Melbourne, although it has less authority over the metropolitan planning, I might write something like national government has separate departments, just to make that clear that there is that difference between the state and the national government. Okay. Let's scroll down and go through another example. This time, let's look at the density indicator. And I'm going to fill in this row that's highlighted for Adelaide this time. Again, another city in Australia, but this time the state of South Australia. And I'm reasonably familiar with the planning context in Adelaide. And so I know that at the time of analysis, there was a really key metropolitan plan, which would have lots of relevant information for the checklist. So it's called the 30-year plan for Greater Adelaide. And so I've downloaded the PDF and I'm looking for relevant content in relation to urban design. So I'm going to go Control F keys to bring up the find function. And I'm looking for content related to density. So I might start to type density or densities, the plural. You might try both of those options. And let's see what relevant content we might find here. So you scroll through. Is this, here's something relevant, in fact, very relevant for this measure around density. So while I'm here, I'm going to copy that. But you can see it reads increased average gross density of development within activity centres as well as transit corridor catchments from 15 to 25 dwellings per hectare as the baseline, aiming for 35 dwellings per hectare. So that seems very relevant to this checklist. And the principle that is relevant to is minimum housing density required to public transport and or town centres that will promote walkability. It's not about minimum housing density citywide, which is the first item. It's this one here. So the first thing I need to do is fill in the policy name. So it's the 30-year plan for Greater Adelaide. And in this case, the level of government, again, there's a drop-down box for you to select from, is the state government. And the adoption date was 2017. So that's a box you just type the year. This is where I can provide the full citation for the policy if I've got it. Or my other option is just to add the URL, and I'm just adding a fake URL there. Next question across is copy the relevant text, providing the page number and the quote. So I know that this was from page 42. And then I'm just going to type it up in the top field here, because it's a little easier to do the formatting. So there I've got the actual wording from the policy and the page number. And this is where, if you're translating, you would enter the translated text. Is the policy mandatory or legally required is the next item. And in this case, no, this is a metropolitan strategic document, not a mandated legislation. So no. And then, does the policy include a measurable target? Again, a drop-down box where you can go yes, no, or unclear. And here it is definitely a yes, because in fact, this wording that I've just entered is a target. It's measurable. It's it could be monitored over time. It's quantifiable. So once I enter yes here, the other cells open up for me to enter the information. So it asks me to copy the relevant target here. Now, because it's exactly the same text, I can literally do that copy paste. But it might be that there's one target within a broader paragraph of text or something that you might just copy just the target into there. But don't worry if it actually duplicates the earlier entry. And then the last question is, if there is a measurable target, is it an evidence-informed threshold? Now, here there's these green cells where if I hover my browser or click on these cells, guidance pops up on what the established evidence is. So for housing density, there is a guidance here that you need at least 25 dwellings per hectare equivalent to support walkability. And so you'll see that not all of the rows have this kind of level of guidance, because there is not established evidence for every single measure in terms of the actual target required, but we have provided that guidance where it is available and established. So here I would say, yes, because this is a target of 35 dwellings per hectare, which is above that minimum of 25 dwellings per hectare. So I would say, yes, it is an evidence-informed target. And I could type something like this to explain why this target is above the recommended minimum of 25 dwellings per hectare, or something similar. There's also the opportunity for me to add, as always, other information or notes to make anything clearer. But let's say in Adelaide, there was actually another policy document that had relevant content for this same principle around housing density minimums. And I need to add that information. Rather than adding it in the same cell, we ask that you add a new row. So to do that, and there's details on how to do this in the instructions tab, but you click on the cell below the one that you would like to enter, right click and press insert, select entire row, and a new row pops in there. And then there's the opportunity for you underneath this principle to add the other policy. So we could have renewal South Australia, and we could, enter the fact that this is the state government as well, and so on and so forth across the row. So that shows you how to add more than one policy per principle. And that is often likely to be the case, that there will be more than one policy relevant to a principle, but particularly there might be more than one policy, or the same policy might be relevant to actually multiple principles. As I'll show in this last example, if I've got time, scroll down a bit further and we've got the design indicator here. And this time, working on a different context, let's look at Chennai in India. And let's say that I'm really familiar with this policy context, and I know that the Corporation of Chennai is the metropolitan level of government, and they have an important document, the Chennai non-motorised transport policy. And I've looked at that policy and I found that there are some policies in here that are aligned with principles of healthy and sustainable cities, particularly these two that I've highlighted and pre-filled the information. So one about maximum size of street blocks, and then under other, I've entered some policy details about prohibiting pedestrian cul-de-sacs, because actually, cul-de-sacs are not good for that street connectivity and walkability. But let's say I wanted to look at this document, the same document, and find if there was anything related to intersection density, or the number of intersections per area. So I would go to the document again. I've downloaded it, but you can find it on the website. And again, Control F to find the relevant content. And I'm interested particularly this time in intersections, because that is the principle. I want to check whether there's anything relevant. So I type intersections, and there's a few examples of the word there. None of them are relevant. But here I've come across some relevant text. The pedestrian network should have at least 80 intersections per square kilometre. So I can copy that text while I'm here and switch back to the checklist. So this is about required minimum number of intersections per area. But does that minimum create street connectivity that supports walkability? Across here, again, there is guidance provided in those green cells suggesting that you need a minimum of 100 intersections per square kilometre. So Chennai has a target of 80 intersections per square kilometre. It's getting there, but it doesn't quite demonstrate the level of ambition needed to support, to align with the evidence. So I wouldn't actually enter that here. I would actually enter that under no in relation to this principle. The requirements for intersection density make street connectivity too low for walkability. And here I could just copy the same information. It's the same policy as above. So that makes it fairly easy. Just entering the same information, the website, and I would copy here. Again, it's on page 12, and copy the relevant text in the field above here. So the pedestrian network should have at least 80 intersections per square kilometre. Is it mandatory? No, again, in this case. Keep coming across. Does it include a measurable target? Yes, this is a measurable target around intersection density, and I could copy the same text in here because it's exactly the same as earlier again, because the policy is actually a target. And then is the target evidence-based? Well, in this case, no, because it doesn't meet that 100 dwellings per square kilometre, 100 intersections, I should say, per square kilometre. So I might type something like the target is too low, and below to explain why I've said that it is not actually evidence-based. So I've been through a few different examples there, and I hope that has provided some clarity on how you deal with where there's policies across multiple different principles in a measure, how to add new rows and enter the information across. And, it might be a bit confusing when you first start, but I think hopefully as you get the hang of it, it's reasonably simple to kind of enter that information in as you go. So, and it also, just to say, it's often an iterative process where you'll begin to fill in the checklist and then find other information in policy documents, or you realise that there's some gaps where you might need to go to policies and actually have another look, just to make sure that in fact you haven't missed that there is relevant information. So it can require a little bit of back and forth in terms of finding policies and entering the details. But before we go to the Q&A, I just wanted to highlight the final steps. Once you've filled in the checklist in full, the last step is validation. So you send the checklist to the 1,000 Cities Challenge team, and Deepti and I will help facilitate checking for any errors. We can come back to you if we've got any questions, but also to work with you to identify others locally in your city, and also particularly who are proficient in local language, to just check, run an eye over, does this intuitively make sense, that we haven't missed anything? And once we have that validation, we can then proceed to generate a scorecard and report that will be included in the Global Observatory. And these reports and scorecards, the format will be amended slightly for the 1,000 Cities Challenge, but basically they provide a summary of the indicator findings in the form of checklists, or in the scorecard, it's a single-page infographic which summarises the policy strengths and limitations, and the report is a longer document which can also highlight how your city compares to others. All right, I think we've now got about 10 minutes for questions. So, Deepti, are you online
Yep.
for facilitating our questions today?
Yeah, I'm just keeping an eye on the chat and the Q&A. So we have one question from Linda. Is there a way to specify indicator coverage spatially, or do you view this information as relevant for the analysis? And can the policy or measure be oriented towards the center only, for example?
So is this question about?
I think it's more spatial indicator specific.
But I suppose perhaps you're also thinking, Linda, about doing the spatial indicators alongside the policy indicators. And I think this is where, if you need some assistance with clarifying that, we're certainly happy to help. If you're assessing the whole metropolitan area as defined spatially for the spatial indicators, it does make sense that you choose the levels of government that most closely administratively follow that spatial boundary. Now, it is often the case that the metropolitan region and the government regions don't 100% line up, and don't worry if that is the case. But I think that's why, if you aim to include the full city, both in terms of policy and administratively, and also the spatial analysis, you'll get that good alignment of the policies. Whereas if you were going to be analysing policies just for a smaller sub-region of the city, but then the spatial indicators, you were going to assess the whole city, there's not such good alignment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think Linda just posted a comment. I wasn't thinking that, but just regarding indicators or principles that sometimes target specific areas instead of the city or metropolitan area as a whole.
Yeah, that's actually okay. We're talking more, when Deepti was talking about the levels of government, it's more about choosing which policy documents you're actually going to look at. Are you going to be looking at the municipal government, or the regional government, or the national government? So if you're looking at the metropolitan government, say, it's okay if they have, for this particular region of the city, we have these these intentions, and for this region, we have different plans. That's okay. But you'd be looking at the document for the whole region, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and Linda also had a question on policy evidence being used, whether we have tips and resources for assessing this for each indicator. Is evidence stemming from global evidence or require locally applicable evidence that is context specific? I'm not. Yeah, Linda, you're also welcome to unmute and discuss if you'd like.
So here there is that level of subjectivity. So I think we have provided the evidence-based guidance for targets, that is, when that's really clear, when there is that established evidence. But it might be that, for something like, the distribution of employment around the city, that there's not really, an absolute threshold that we can point to saying, yep, you need to have, exactly this distribution of employment. So this is where you can go to your local knowledge of best practice. You can go to your own knowledge of the evidence base to date, even if it may not be, definitively an answer about a particular threshold. But let's take the example of distribution of employment. If there was a target to actually have really well distributed employment across the city, so that everyone was really close, could live and work within the same area. If there was a target around that, even if we don't know what the evidence says about the threshold, it sounds pretty good, doesn't it? So we'd actually probably say yes, and you would explain that. You'd say, look, this policy aims for a really high, a really high level of distributed employment, and so that 90% of people can work in the same region in which they live. That's really great. Carl, they're answering a couple of questions.
Yeah, I don't see any other questions yet, but.
And for those of you who haven't met Carl Higgs, who is busy answering a few questions behind the scenes, Carl co-leads the spatial indicator work for the 1,000 Cities Challenge. So if you have attended our webinars or attend future and look at future training resources for the spatial indicators, that will be with Carl. Any final questions before we wrap up? Oh, Linda's got one more there. When it comes to validation, we don't need to carry out an intercoder reliability test, formal assessment of validity. No, that's not required for the 1,000 Cities Challenge, but if you are having multiple people, help fill in the checklist, it's not a bad idea. And it sounds like you're obviously familiar with that methodology around, checking consistency, so that, I'm not completely making different judgments to Deepti, and there's a whole range of methodologies for doing that. So I think by all means do that as part of your own processes, but no, we don't have a formal requirement for that. And in terms of validation is more checking that what you've included in the policy checklist accurately reflects the reality of the policy context in your city. So rather than reliability, it's about checking that, really for accuracy. So hence the fact that we'll be checking that we haven't missed anything, and that we could check with people who have local knowledge of policy context to actually cast an eye over and say, yep, this seems to be right, that the right policies are in there, nothing's been too, misrepresented, and that kind of thing. Did you have anything to add, Deepti?
No, I think that covers it. What I would say is we did do inter-rater reliability for the first set of 25 cities. Melanie and I did that, and we selected a random sample from within our 25 cities and did that. But we definitely encourage you to do that if you'd like, and if you have the capacity to do that.
And that was the beauty of having the proof of concept study that we've based this new checklist on, is because we're able to demonstrate using different people using the checklist, that we could have that consistency across different people. So I suppose that created some level of confidence that we could develop a checklist that people could consistently use across different contexts. Excellent. So if there's no more questions, did you want me to stop sharing, or I can keep going and just show the last few slides, Deepti?
Yeah, go ahead, Melanie. Yeah.
Did you want to go through these, or?
Sure, I'll just sum it all up. So thank you everyone for joining us. What we have on the screen is a QR code if you'd like to scan to sign up and join the 1,000 Cities Challenge. We also have linked our website there, and you'll get regular updates. We have a Twitter handle. And Melanie, if you want to go to the next one, we also have our contact information. Both our email addresses on there, and also the general email address to our observatory. So please reach out to us for any questions, any clarification, and we'd be happy to support you with your data collection for the policy indicators.
And just to reiterate again, it is important that you've signed up to the email list. You've obviously heard about this training, so you most likely are, but do get interested people in your teams or whatever to sign up, partly to potentially connect with other people who are working on your city that you may not be aware of. But the other thing is we will likely be posting other resources to the website, both for the policy and the spatial indicators. We may well be holding some training later in the year. More information will be coming around validation and the reporting steps. So, do make sure you're in the loop with those things if you're going to be joining us on this exciting 1,000 Cities Challenge journey. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. And thank you very much for your questions and participation. Thanks, Deepti, for running these sessions and staying up to the middle of the night. And hopefully we see you all at future events, and good luck with your data collection.
Thank you.
Bye.
See you, Klaus.
Bye-bye.
See you, Melanie.
Okay, I think that went well.
Should I stop the recording at this point? Yeah.